So January 27th, as we'll see well, you can see in source number 2, was set up as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And when we talk about remembering the Shoah, it has a little bit of every day is Remembrance Day, especially those who have been impacted most personally and directly. But in general, sort of as we've discussed in other approaches, it's difficult to capture and encapsulate an idea for remembering the Holocaust. But that is what's taking place today. Different ceremonies take place in formal ways and informal ways. And that got me thinking that it was a good time to mention a subject I have thought about but was reminded about just last week with regards to the role that the mourner's Kaddish plays in remembrance, in solemn ritual recitation. And it's essentially kind of a universally known prayer amongst those who remember, not necessarily explicitly in its religious context. It has a specific religious context. The Kaddish does, as we will see. But it's something that whenever there's something somber to remember, there's a Kaddish to be recited. And this is certainly true in the broader Jewish world. Could be that in the Orthodox community, we're more familiar with Kaddish in its ritual sense. In the mourners who say it, and people who are not mourners should not be saying it. In fact, that there's certain types and when and where. But there's just this idea that Kaddish, something bad happens to be remembered, you say a Kaddish. And that came to mind to me in a headline last week, source number 1, that the mourners Kaddish recited in Australian Parliament for Bondi Beach attack victims. We know that last week they marked the Shloshim of that horrific murderous attack. And so this is from the JTA last week. A Jewish member of Australian Parliament recited the mourners Kaddish in an address Monday to honor the victims of the Hanukkah massacre on Bondi Beach. The address, delivered by Jewish parliamentarian and former Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, came over a month after 2 gunmen motivated by what authorities said was Islamic State ideology opened fire on a celebration in Sydney, killing 15 and injuring dozens more. Most of the victims were Jewish. And Dreyfus read all of their names aloud. Dreyfus, who wore a kippah for the presentation, then commended the acts of extraordinary courage by bystanders and emergency workers during the attack, naming Ahmed al-Ahmed, the Muslim man who received widespread support from the Jewish community after he was shot while disarming one of the attackers. He also told the Australian House of Representatives that the country's response cannot be confined to grief, exhorting his fellow lawmakers to take action around upholding our laws against hate, and invited everyone present to rise for the mourners Kaddish, recited in Jewish communities in memory of the dead. You don't have to be Jewish to feel this in your chest. An attack like this hurts all of us, Dreyfus said, describing the prayer as a prayer about life, dignity, and the hope for peace at times of profound loss. Public recitation was redundant of the decision of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette to publish the Hebrew text of the prayer on its front page following the murder of 11 Jews in their synagogue there in 2018. So the idea that terrible things happen to Jews, Kaddish gets recited. And, a couple of themes which I think, stand out, and then I'm happy to take some additional reactions. First, he mentions they mentioned that the Hebrew text of the Kaddish was published. Guess what? Kaddish is not in Hebrew. It's mostly Aramaic. The fact that they talk about Kaddish as a prayer about life, dignity, and hope, and peace does reference some of the words of the Kaddish. And of course, one of the things that people are not always so aware, Kaddish mentions absolutely nothing about death. There's nothing about death in Kaddish. It's about life. In the burial Kaddish, or the Kaddish that we say at the end of the Siyum, there's resurrection. But there's this idea that the Kaddish is recited in memory for the dead. He talks about the non-Jewish role in Kaddish, in appreciating it, maybe even reciting it. What's the role for Kaddish in non-Jews? Do we say is Kaddish recited over the non-Jewish dead, or what is the role for Kaddish amongst non-Jews? Is it explicitly Jewish, or is there something that non-Jewish that extends to it? And this idea, I recall in some of my first trips that I took with rabbis from different denominations, with Jewish federations in North America or UJA, places like Budapest or Russia. Right, whenever there'd be a stop at a memorial, there was always a need, generally by one of the non-Orthodox rabbis, who's going to say the Kaddish. It's almost that the Kaddish has to be recited in these solemn moments of remembrance. And I think there definitely is something to it, as we will see. But we'll unpack some sources and come back to some of these themes. Just to put a little closure onto the history of the day, source number 2, the United Nations General Assembly designated January 27, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, a time to remember the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the millions of other victims of Nazi persecution. And this was the United Nations, not always most aligned with our values and ideology, but it is the day that's there. And the Jewish community in general, even in the state of Israel, they recognize the day, even though we have Yom HaShoah as our official commemoration. But this day has taken on a certain element of Holocaust remembrance worldwide. And I think what's happened, and we'll see a little bit in the next couple of sources, that if there's an opportunity to reinforce the memory, the legacy, the messages of the Shoah in public settings, we'll take advantage of it. Any reactions to or questions about the Kaddish, the mourners Kaddish, and the presentation of where we're going before we dive into the sources? So, as we dive in, someone who noted the unique place of International Holocaust Remembrance Day within the Jewish community was Jewish historian Jenna Weissman-Jocelyn. A couple of years ago, she wrote an article, the fact that for Jews, January 27th is not a Yom HaShoah, it's not a Holocaust Remembrance Day, right? It was chosen because the liberation of Auschwitz, liberation and the end of and freeing, is a powerful emotional day, even if it's marking the end of a tragedy. We've spoken about that before, and certainly are feeling it today with the return of the remains of Ron Gvili. Yesterday, the end of the hostage saga, no more hostages in Gaza for the first time since 2014. And we've spoken about the bracha of Hatov V'Hameitiv, which was instituted, the idea of God does good when things like burying of the dead take place. But January 27th is, kind of, you ask most, sadly, people don't follow the Shoah in general, but it's not really marked. It's not kind of necessarily something that Jewish day schools will do something as a commemoration. Right? Yom HaShoah is when all of the focus takes place. If you go in a more religious approach, and we've addressed this before, Tisha B'Av, is something. The Holocaust. We have our day for it, but it's not the international day. And Jocelyn talks about this in source number 3. World Jewry, for its part, seems to have little need for a one-day-a-year affair like International Holocaust Remembrance Day. When earnest, well-intentioned evocations of the Holocaust suffuse the modern Jewish experience in virtually all its institutions, from museums and monuments to the classroom and summer camping. Besides, modern-day Jews have their own, especially Jewish Day of commemoration. Yom HaShoah, which strategically positioned between Passover and Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Day of Independence, takes place on the 27th Hebrew month of Nisan. What then are we to make of International Holocaust Remembrance Day? Where might it belong in the grand scheme of things? Circling back to the distinction between history and memory, I'd suggest that the UN-sponsored initiative stands for history. It's a date on the historical calendar, recognizing the history of the Holocaust, while Yom HaShoah does honors for memory. The first documents and instructs. The second welds those who observe it into a community with a shared past. Right? There's history and there's memory. There's the facts and the figures, and there's the legacy and the emotion. Or, a distinction I like to use, there's information and there's communication. It's a distinction that resonates. The fact that the history of the Holocaust is important, and that January 27th was a red-lettered historical date for the Shoah, liberation of Auschwitz. But our memory and our legacy and our commemoration and our lessons, that's something that goes deeper and transcends historical facts and the like. And I think that aspect of commemoration and memory is one where Yom HaShoah, which is its own discussion, is discussed. But in particular, I think that's the role that Kaddish has taken on. The idea that Kaddish as a prayer to memorialize the dead, the fact that mourners recite it, the fact that it's become this almost essential recitation when terrible tragedies happen, and it has a unique, halachic or textual relationship with the Shoah. That we've entered a time in a place where Kaddish is one of the automatic responses to death, terror, Kaddish. And let's see how that unfolds, just because where does Kaddish come from? So the origins of Kaddish are based on pasuk in Yecheskel, source number 4, V'yiskadalti v'yiskadashti, or Yiskadilti v'yiskadishti, the idea Yiskadal v'yiskadash. The vocalization is its own discussion. But thus I will manifest my greatness and my holiness and make myself known in the sight of many nations, and they shall know that I am God. And there's the idea of sharing God's glory amongst the many nations. This is not just a Jewish idea, the idea of glorifying God, the idea of Kiddush Hashem, the idea of spreading the teachings of Judaism as they pertain to make the world a better place. That's what Kaddish is about. That's the theme that Yecheskel taught the nation in the name of God. That's what God wants to see take place. Now, translating that into a prayer is something that we see not necessarily textually with that we're familiar with, but we do mention this idea in brachos that anytime, source 5, anytime that God's greatness is evoked, just as when Israel enters the synagogue and study halls and answers the Kaddish prayer, may his great name be blessed. Amen Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivarach. Right, this is the Steinsaltz translation and commentary. The Gemara doesn't mention recitation of Kaddish. The Gemara says, when is God's great name evoked? When the community says Yehei Shmei Rabba. Right, that God shakes his head and says, happy is the king who is thus praised in his house. When the temple stood, this praise was recited there, but now how great is the pain of the father who exiled his children, woe to the children who were exiled from their father's table. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivarach. God's name should be blessed forever and ever. That is a seminal declaration that draws the Jewish nation closer to their Father in heaven. So it's about the relation between God and the Jewish people. Declaring it is also considered has religious value. Source number 6, Shabbat 119b, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, anyone who says Amen Yehei Shmei Rabba wholeheartedly with all his might, they rip up his evil decree. So, there's a shortcut. You want to make sure nothing bad happens, say Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivarach Li'olam Li'olei Maya very loudly. And this is really the springboard for, if you've ever heard someone say it really loudly, either just saying it loudly or really loudly, or even think about how the liturgical music goes, that of the Kaddish, which musically is the declaration that everybody sings. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivarach Li'olam Li'olei Maya. That is coming from here. We want everyone to say it. That's a powerful declaration. Again, we still don't yet have the construct of the Kaddish that we recite in synagogue in different ways, but we're beginning this idea of sanctification, glorification, declaring it loudly as being in consonance with what God wants to see in this world, and there being religious value. It's in a certain sense a shortcut for no evil decrees. There are other shortcuts that get mentioned. People might be familiar with anyone who says Ashrei 3 times a day, go straight to Olam Haba. And it's probably not as easy as just saying those words, but it's one who says Ashrei and believes in the themes of Ashrei, which are many and are powerful, or one who believes in Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivarach. That is the type of religious personality who's on the right path.
We do this day in and day out. When Gvili came, we try to turn it into, we don't understand Hashem's reasons for things. We've tried to put a positive bent. Do we really believe it? It's just internalizing. And
in general, the Kaddish as redirection in terms of after tragedy is, we'll see, because right now we haven't even seen, there's no sense in the Gemara in Talmud about Kaddish as responding to mourning or sadness. It's essentially there as a helping to expound upon the idea and publicize God's greatness, ensure that we believe in that, and we should do that, and there is even a promised reward for articulating that. Now, between the Talmud, so you're talking about the year 600 and the year 1000, as the liturgy developed, there was this idea of a connection between making this type of a declaration and it being of value to the soul of the departed or for the mourner themselves emerged. Shuvot HaGaonim, so the Gaonim are in that period, between Talmud and medieval Jewish history. So, source number 7, concerning the origin of Kaddish that you asked, we cannot trace the practice to a clear and definitive source found among our ancestors' writings. However, those who followed them based their recitation of Kaddish upon the verse, and I will be sanctified within the people of Israel and people of Israel. Right? This is the Torah verse about Vis Kaddish Tem Yisem Kedoshim, and I will be sanctified. What our rabbinic leaders extrapolated from the verse: that any prayer which results in the sanctification of the name of God must be recited in a group of 10 men. This is where the idea of being a religious congregation. From these teachings, we conclude that when 10 men congregate to perform a mitzvah, whether it be for prayer or for a study of Torah, they must recite a prayer in which they sanctify the name of God. Right. So we have the idea now that Kaddish is being recited when there's a mitzvah, Kaddish is being recited when there's prayer, and Kaddish is recited within a prayer community requiring a minyan. So it's a wonderful aspiration from Yechezkel. It's a ritualistic opportunity that speaks about relationship and is of religious value in the Talmud, and it becomes crystallized into performance of mitzvos and the idea of prayer, Torah study, and the like. In fact, it seems that we'll see a reference to another Gemara that in Sota, that it seems that the Kaddish was an appropriate declaration after a public lecture. Right, so we're familiar. There are various Kaddishes. There's the half Kaddish, there's the whole Kaddish, there's the mourner's Kaddish, there's the rabbi's Kaddish, Kaddish D'Rabbanan. That's Al Yisrael, V'al Rabbanan, V'al Talmidehon. For those who come to JCAB, it's the one I say aloud at the end of davening. Right, that's the rabbi's Kaddish. That really has nothing to do with mourners, even though mourners today say it. It seems that was the appropriate declaration. We just studied Torah together. We're in a holy congregation of the Tzibor, of at least the Minyan. Let's declare God's greatness and let's pray. Al Yisrael V'al Rabbanan, for Israel and the rabbis who are studying Torah. So it begins to have a more concrete placement in this ritual setting. And as you move forward, it turns into also connecting to mourning and mourners and mourning. Source number 8, Sefer Mate Moshe, 16th century. After Aleinu, they recite Kaddish. We learned in Midrashim that a son should recite Baruch Hu and be the leader in synagogue. Through these acts, he relieves the punishment of his deceased parents, as it is written in Midrash Tanchuma for Pashano Masechet Kal, a chapter entitled Rav Yudah. So the practice of mourners reciting Kaddish during the mourning period was instituted because of minors and later because of adults who did not have the ability to lead the services. So for this reason, the Kaddish became known as the orphan's Kaddish, Kaddish Yasom, or mourner's Kaddish. Yasom is technically orphan. It's the orphan's Kaddish, mourner's Kaddish, and the like. And so what the Mate Moshe is referencing is there is some rabbinic tradition, in the post-Talmudic period. So developing, between the 5th, 6th, between Middle Ages, there was this idea that to help achieve atonement for the deceased, it's a nice concept to do something. So it was, if you want to honor the soul of the departed, lead the services, read from the Torah, answer the declarations in the worship declarations in shul, and it became, as the Mate Moshe says, look, you should lead the service, you should daven, you should read the Haftorah, but not everyone knows how. Also, what about minors who lose their parent and can't participate at that level because they're not of majority age, or not gedolim, they're not bar mitzvah. So Kaddish was instituted as a kind of a mechanism to do something to elevate the soul or to achieve atonement for the soul. And that itself is a complicated spiritual issue. There's a very famous rabbinic tradition. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago in our Judaism from A to Z series. We talked about K is for Kaddish, that there was a tradition, that there was this vision that rabbis saw someone who was carrying wood, and then it turned out that it was some sort of spirit who says that his eternal damnation is to keep carrying the wood, and he's never done carrying the wood. And they said, well, how can we help you? And he said, have my son either recite Torah for me, or pray for me, or say the Haftorah for me. So there began this kind of spiritual tradition to recite Kaddish as part of that atonement for the soul process. Now, it undergoes real, I would say, to some level, religious radicalization in terms of it being for the mourner, with the rise of Kabbalah, the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, who started to attach all sorts of what he called yichudim and tikkunim, spiritually fixing the universe the more you say Kaddish. And he was a big proponent of saying more Kaddishes, and even for mourners to say more Kaddishes for the deceased. And this led to, again, putting more Kaddishes in assigning Kaddish, even without necessarily the mystical intentionality. But we see by the time we're in the 16th, 17th century, the Kaddish is developing. The Kaddish is connected with mourners, the orphans, departed loved ones, and the like. And there's also the popularity of Kaddish. The Kaddish kind of rises into something that everyone became familiar with, and seem to, almost they aspire to say it. Sometimes people who are Avelim, who go out of their way never to miss a Kaddish. Right? That is a laudable concept, but it doesn't really have a basis. The rabbis in the Talmud would find it very strange for mourners to be reciting Kaddish in the first place, and certainly this idea that you have to take a flight to Israel to catch the minyan on your way to London so you'll be able to catch the Kaddish, which is wonderful. That doesn't have a solid halachic line of transmission from the Talmud to today. It's something that came about new, which I think came from the popularization of Kaddish. And part of that seems to be based on the fact that Kaddish is in the vernacular. Well, he's mentioned before the article that talks about the Hebrew text of the Kaddish. It's Aramaic. And the question was asked, why is it Aramaic? Why Aramaic? And it seems, Tosfot source number 9, one says Kaddish in Aramaic, since the prayer is so fitting and such great praise, it was established in the language of the Targum, the vernacular, so that the angels would not understand and become jealous. Right, there's this idea that we say things in Aramaic when we don't want the angels to understand, because it's special for us. And so since it's so special, it's about God's glory and glorification and about peace and about prayers being accepted, we don't want the angels to have anything to do with that. So they don't know. It's kind of like you wonder after thousands of years they might pick up something. But in any event, Tosfot himself, the Tosfot doesn't like this either. He says, no, that's not this. This doesn't work, because it can't be correct. Because there are other beautiful prayers in Hebrew that could also be the angels will be envious of. So Tosfot's answer: the real reason Kaddish is in Aramaic, Sota 49a, that the world only continues to exist because of the Kedusha, the Sidra, in the main Yeheshme Rabbah after Agadah. There's something religiously special about this, right? That's another declaration similar to the ones we saw in Brachot and Shabbat, that saying Yeheshme Rabbah is a powerful religious engagement. So the people were accustomed to say Kaddish after a drasha. They got used to it. And being ordinary folk, they didn't understand the Holy Tongue at all. We weren't praying in Hebrew, so it was fixed in the vernacular, which everyone understood. Okay, that's the way it was. It was a powerful, important declaration that everyone was meant to have a share in. Everyone was meant to be a part of it. And so it just stuck, vernacular, since we're all speaking Aramaic today, right? No, that was the vernacular then, and it became etched in the religious, spiritual consciousness that Kaddish is an important declaration. Now, people today may have no awareness that the important declaration had to do more with the religious and spiritual opportunity to declare God's holiness and greatness. Now they may think it's about memory and sadness, but look at what the nation is doing. This was something that as Kaddish evolved and developed, there were some significant questions ritualistically how to do it. Who says it? Right? There still are some synagogues, very few, that only one mourner says the Kaddish on behalf of everyone. It's actually an honor. Some shows you pay for the honor to be the Kaddish, the mourner who says the Kaddish, and then the other mourners don't say the Kaddish. Other questions, for example, do you sit or stand? As is often the answer in that question, the answer is, both, or really you fight over whether you sit or stand. So you have all these different customs developed. Also, who do you say Kaddish for? As we'll see, is Kaddish, do you say Kaddish over someone who's truly wicked? What's the purpose of declaring God's greatness on someone who denies God's existence? or what ages, or are there exceptions that people don't need Kaddish? So all this discussion turned into this kind of a phenomenon that we have this kind of the Kaddish Jew, the person who comes to shul just for Kaddish, just like we have the Yisker Jew. And it was actually something discussed in the 20th century in the early years of the Reform movement in America, the idea of the Kaddish Jew. And they were actually addressing, the rabbis of the Reform movement were addressing sitting or standing during Kaddish. And they analyzed some of the textual sources that relate to how that would apply from a halachic perspective, more from a historical perspective. And they finally come to the conclusion that basically, Kaddish has such resonance that it represents something religiously significant, so much so that for some it's their only connection to liturgy or to synagogue participation. It's okay for everyone to stand up for it, even though we don't usually like to burden people by we have this idea of tircha de tzibur. We don't like to burden the congregation. Well, guess what? We don't want to burden the congregation by standing up and down for Kaddish. You know what? They're coming to shul. It's important to them. The Reform rabbis actually invoke mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. So they may only be coming for the Kaddish, but maybe this will spark more interest in greater synagogue participation. So the idea of the Kaddish being something that does become enunciated, articulated, recited anytime there's a tragedy, anytime there's something sad, is something that has certainly evolved and developed throughout the Jewish history. And even the rabbis were aware of it and recognized it in the various turning points for the Kaddish to be recited, the period of the Gaonim, the Middle Ages, 16th, 17th century, the role for mourners and the like. We'll shift in a moment to just looking at what the Holocaust and the Shoah religiously may have contributed to Kaddish. Questions or comments? Okay, so let's look a little bit more at the Shoah. And when it comes to the Shoah, in terms of its magnitude and its incomprehensibility in how to religiously respond to the Shoah is a much larger conversation and not for now. But I did want to mention the fact that when grappling religiously with the Shoah, there's no clear guidance. And I wanted to do that by one of the teachings of Rabbi Kalanimus Kalman Shapiro, the PSS, the Rebbe, known as the Eish Kodesh. Eish Kodesh were his teachings that he gave in the Warsaw Ghetto from 1940 to early 1943, when they were, when he was sent to the concentration camp before the liquidation of the ghetto. And so he often talks about faith, and this is a piece that he gave in Hanukkah 1941. And what was happening is that he would transcribe the teachings, and the notes were ultimately saved and preserved and buried as part of this trove, the Oneg Shabbos trove of documents that were buried in milk cans in the Warsaw Ghetto and were found and ultimately published. So it's Hanukkah, and he's talking about faith, and he's talking about overcoming challenges and the like. So he writes, total devotion means to continue to believe in him even when times when he is hidden, and that everything is derived from him, all good and just, and all the torments are filled with God's love to his people, the Jews. Right? Suffering is endemic to the Jewish condition. It is with deep sorrow that even amongst those who always believe wholeheartedly, there are now some individuals whose faith has been damaged. These individuals question God, asking, why have you forsaken us? They argue that if we are being tortured to bring us closer to worship and Torah, how is this that the Torah and everything that is holy are being destroyed? Right? He's saying that, look, these days, some are questioning this, right? If we were Torah, we're being persecuted, and the things that we're supposed to be drawn closer to are being destroyed. If a Jew talks this way as a prayer or supplication, pouring out his heart before God, a good thing it may be. It's one thing that declaring this is horrible because you want it to get better. That's one thing. However, if God forbid this individual is indeed questioning, even if not God directly, it is then his internal faith that is damaged, God forbid, that may God protect us. Faith is the foundation of all. When a person's faith is, God forbid, damaged, then God forbid this person is torn apart and is distanced from God. Right? So this is the Rebbe saying, the pain and suffering now shouldn't lead you to question God. In all honesty, What room is there for doubts, God forbid, and for questions? It is true that torments such as those that we currently endure occur only every several hundred years. However, how can we attempt to understand God's actions or having our faith damaged, God forbid, once we fail to understand them? If one blade of grass created by God is beyond our understanding, how are we to understand the soul? Or even less, so how are we to understand an angel or the mind of God himself? How can we expect to understand with our mind what God knows and understands? Why is it that one who has faith damaged by questioning God because of the suffering the Jews endure these days and not because they had before? Right? You're suffering, that's one thing, but Jews have always suffered. Why would such a person have his soul damaged now? Well, it was not damaged when he read and heard about the Jewish suffering throughout the years as described in the Torah, Talmud, or Midrash. Those who say that Jews never had to endure such torments and suffering are mistaken. Such torments were the fate of the Jews during the destruction of the temple at Beitar, etc. May God have mercy and call an end to our suffering. May he save us immediately for now and forever. He's writing on Hanukkah, a time when they overcame suffering. And so, again, this is the Rebbe saying that we have to remain strong in our faith regardless of the suffering. And what we're experiencing now, Hanukkah 1941, is no reason for that to change. This is just another in the line of the persecutions the Jewish people have faced throughout history. However, there's a footnote that, and we have in the transcript that was written later on, and that was written the following year, right before Hanukkah, so 1942. Only such suffering and torment as those endured until the latter part of the year 5702 were previously recorded in Jewish history. However, from the end of 5702 onwards, right, this is talking about fall 1942. According to my knowledge of the writings of our sages, may their memory be blessed, and of the history of the Jewish people in general, such bizarre torments and evil, outlandish deaths as those designed for us, the house of Israel, by these wicked, strange murderers are unprecedented. May God have mercy upon us and swiftly save us from their hands. 18 Kislev 5703. Hanukkah 1941, Rebbe was saying the Holocaust is no different, just like all the other tragedies and suffering. By the time you get to Hanukkah 1942, Kislev 5703, that which had been endured since the previous year changed the Rebbe's mind. And in recognizing that theologically things are different. Again, has no answers, but it's an important theological shift that's taking place according to the PSS and the Rebbe, that means that the Holocaust impacted the Jewish religious psyche differently. And this, people say it's the same as all Tisha B'Av. We're not talking about the theological responses to the Holocaust, but the fact that the Holocaust had such an impact, and this is seeing the Rebbe's eyewitness testimony and his responses in real time religiously to it, certainly, I think, impacted how commemorating it and memorializing it and ritualizing it afterwards, there was no good answer. So there was grasping at straws to find what's the way to respond to the Holocaust, or commemorating the Holocaust, or honoring those who were murdered in the Holocaust. And one of the lowest hanging fruit turned into the Kaddish. And that's why the Israeli chief rabbinate, before there was a state of Israel, but the Rabbinate Council in 1945 declared, started saying that we were going to take Asara B'Teves, the 10th day of Teves, and turn it into Yom HaKaddish HaKlali. We're going to turn it into the day that everyone who lost relatives who were murdered in the Holocaust should say Kaddish, even if they don't know the Yahrzeit. And again, ritually, there's really no strong source for saying Kaddish for a Yahrzeit. And there's also no strong source for saying Kaddish when you don't know when the Yahrzeit is. We're going to see there's certain exceptions in Jewish tradition where Kaddish may not be appropriate. But, and you see Rabbi Yaakov Ariel reinforcing the role that the Kaddish, Yom HaKaddish HaKlali, the 10th of Teves, as a Kaddish day for the Holocaust should be reinforced, even though, quite frankly, most people don't know about it. I'm sure we did a poll around today. How many people here are familiar with Yom HaKaddish HaKlali? It's not something that caught on, right? I'd probably say International Holocaust Remembrance Day is catching on more than Yom HaKaddish HaKlali these days. But Rabbi Yaakov Ariel, it seems, in my humble opinion, that the need for this declaration grows with time as the community of survivors dwindles and our forgetfulness grows. We must impress and continue to impress upon the public not to forget that which Amalek did to our generation, and to encourage the entire public to recite the Kaddish. Not mourners. Everyone should say Kaddish. I'm thinking about the Holocaust commemorations I would attend as a kid, when at the end of the service, the MC would say, now let's all recite the Kaddish. And everybody there, men, women, children, religious, less religious, everyone knew Yiskadal, Yiskadash, Shmei Rabbah. And so I think that it's the shift towards Kaddish as a theological response to suffering, to Jewish suffering, to tragedy, is in line with the enormity of the Holocaust, as the PSS Rebbe expresses in this powerful footnote. There's also the shift in terms of the Kaddish, even if it doesn't have a direct halachic rationale, being invoked for Holocaust commemoration. In a few responses of Rabbi Ephraim Oshri, who wrote the Shilos Uchulos Mimamakim, from the depths, was a rabbi in Lithuania who survived the Holocaust. He then was on the Lower East Side and has several volumes of response of very heart-wrenching questions relating to the Shoah. Several have been translated in halachic, the theological responses to the Holocaust. But here are just a couple of those questions that came up around Kaddish, which I think reinforce this idea of Kaddish as commemoration, as religious commemoration, separate from its role as a ritual commemoration that mourners have in the year after the passing of a loved one. So the first question that we'll look at had to do with martyrs, religious martyrs who die sanctifying God's name. Do you need to recite Kaddish? And this was dealt with by the Middle Ages, by the Maharil, right, in the 12th century. And so the Maharil was asked, if someone is killed al Kiddush Hashem, do you say Kaddish? You don't have to mourn for those who are killed sanctifying God's name. They're tzaddikim, they're righteous. We venerate, we don't mourn. I actually heard a situation in Prague that Jews were murdered. And they thought maybe not to mourn. But they agreed that they should be mourning. Right, the thinking is, why do we mourn and say Kaddish? To elevate their souls. They don't need any spiritual elevation. They're higher than the high. And so what's the purpose in mourning or saying Kaddish? It's kind of similar to the idea that has been discussed that when Jews are murdered for being Jewish, they die al Kiddush Hashem, they don't have to have a tahara. You don't have to have the ritual preparation of the body because they are as holy as can be. They don't need any additional purification. So here too, they don't need any additional elevation. But in Prague, the Maharil said that they would have, you could still mourn for them because there's an emotional sadness that's still connected. So Mikozos Horesi, Rabbi Ephraim Ashri says, he was asked about the ninth fort in Kovna. Velomor achareim Kaddish, and say Kaddish for them. Nora v'ayom hayam areh shakol hatzibur hanishar b'chaim beghetto amar kulo b'kol echad Kaddish al yakirei libo chemle nafsho. Right, and he says it was an awesome sight when the people, the survivors of that massacre, recited Kaddish for their loved ones. V'yiratzon sharof lishvurolei v'achmoshes atzveisenu. May God quickly heal the broken and bring redemption. So Kaddish, the idea, we want to say Kaddish, we want to have a religious response, even if the traditional religious response does not require mourning, does not require Kaddish. It's something that we feel we want to say, and it's very powerful, religiously powerful to have it said, even if there's no obligation. And we can parallel what happened in Prague in the medieval times, and we have seen this with our own eyes during the Holocaust. Kaddish can be that religiously elevating experience, even without the ritual or specifically halachic baggage. Next question about Kaddish that doesn't need to be recited, but maybe it should be. Source number 13. What about saying Kaddish for minors? Right, Stechemet says, right, you don't say Kaddish for anyone who passed away before the age of 20. This is connected to the idea that you don't begin to become punished for your sins until 20. So if you're not of an age to be punished, You don't need any kapara. You don't need any atonement, right? And he quotes the Shahamakubalim Horu Lomar Kaddish Gama Pachos Viben Esrim. There's a Kabbalistic reason. You can get even higher. Even if it's a young baby, 30 days older or more. You should say Kaddish. So Horesi Lahorim Haumlalim Sheshiklu Espinahem Achmal Nasham Lomar Kaddish Al Tanim Shnerigu Al Yidei Azidim Orim Lachar Lamed Yom V'Leidasam. So Rabbi Shvi said, I told parents whose children were murdered, as long as they were over 30 days old, they should say Kaddish. Again, this idea, the emotional imperative of saying Kaddish, because that's how we want to respond. It also invokes the mystical. Kaddish is producing or facilitating a reconnection in a spiritual sense that we don't fully understand. Maybe that's also if the person in the eyes of or the soul of the reciter. It's not just for the spiritual of the impacted of the murdered, but it's also that's the religious response. We need to do something. Kaddish is what first comes to our lips, and then a third unconventional Kaddish response from Rabbi Oshri on source number 14 was asked about someone who wanted to say Kaddish for the righteous Gentile who saved his life, and it has to do with saying Kaddish for non-Jews. So he says that Kaddish is, if you look at Hine Etzem Kaddish in Yanov V'Tochanahu Inyan Tefila Ubakasha. It's not. It's a request. You think back to what the Piaseczner Rebbe said. If someone says God these are so terrible in an aspirational sense, that's not questioning God. So Kaddish also is not making a request, or Kaddish is aspiring for things to be better. And he says that we have manuscripts that the Kaddish was sometimes adjusted to the times that they were in, highlighting its petitionary declaration nature. So it says at the times when the Rabbi Nassan Habavli was appointed to be head of the diaspora, it was the position of the exilar, the head of the diaspora. Hachazan kishamar Kaddish v'yagia lebachayechonu v'yomechonu v'chayei beis Yisrael. When he got to that part, he would say v'chayei nisienu rosh galus v'chayei beis Yisrael. He would personally mention the exilar. And similarly, in the Rambam, they would say in the Kaddish, "Chayechonu v'yomechonu v'chayei marana Moshe ben Maimon l'chol beis Yisrael." So Kaddish had a certain timely nature or adjustment because we're hoping that we want God to be glorified in these times. It's declaration, request for the future. It's not something that's kind of etched in stone. Should certainly be able to say Kaddish for this righteous Gentile woman. Is able to ensure that the Nazis did not murder them. We have in the Sefer HaChasidim that you can pray on behalf of non-Jews who do good things for Jews. So if you can pray on their behalf, Kaddish is also praying on behalf of the world. So you can have them in mind in saying Kaddish. Again, there's no straight line for requiring this. There could even be those, and Rabbi Oshri's opinion is not uniformly accepted with regards to non-Jews in general. Some people felt that this was a kind of a one-off because of the righteous Gentile situation. But we see that Kaddish is not necessarily connected to Avelut. It's a declaration, an aspiration. It's a religious response. And Rabbi Yehuda Amital, who survived the Holocaust and became the founder of Yeshivat Har Etzion, noted this with regards to the communal Kaddish, in particular, discussing the Kaddish for the martyrs of the Holocaust and how the Israeli chief rabbinate declared the 10th of Tevet as Yom HaKaddish HaKlali. The communal Kaddish is the innermost, most authentic expression of the Jewish nation. It demonstrates our faith's attitude towards everything that is bound up in the word Holocaust, a word that is only a code for all that took place there. Since there is no word or sentence or article or book that could describe what happened, we use the code word Holocaust. By reciting Kaddish as a congregation, the Jewish nation expresses its feelings towards the Holy One in the wake of the Holocaust. Our religious attitude towards the Holocaust revolves around two axes, both of which find expression in our religious literature. I shall not go into detail, but anyone who was there saw that the events were not natural. I saw the hand of God, but not the explanation, the meaning. He spoke to me, but I understood nothing. We saw the hand of God, we saw God's word, but what was he saying? It is not an easy test to maintain our faith after all that and to say, may God's great name be exalted and sanctified. The idea that the Kaddish, if we know what we're saying, is really grappling with how we relate to God, even in the most profound and inexplicable moments. And in many ways, we've seen that these last 2 years since October 7th. The idea of Kaddish, an article that was written a year ago in the Yediot Achronot and published on its website, around the Kaddish, now closely identified with death, more and more stirring voices accrued about the final moments of Jews. One is the story of the Admor of Karlin, Rabbi Avram Elimelech Perlo, who arrived in Israel from Poland in 1939, but chose to return to the killing fields, claiming he cannot abandon his followers. When he returned to Poland, he was offered escape again, but refused and requested. But when taken by the Nazis on his final journey, he left behind a sitter open to the page of Kaddish. Seeing what was coming, Shaul Maislish says, the Admor, while in Poland, before the full scale of slaughter was yet revealed, directed that his prayer be repeated again and again. Within a few years, it became the Kaddish of the ashes of the millions of Polish Jews. Today, the Kaddish is identified with the end of life even more than the Shema. He notes, not everyone knows how to say the Shema, but every Jew who departs from a loved one meets a Kaddish at a funeral and in moments of disaster. Moments of this kind, one's personal family became, over the past 2 years, a native of collective Israeli tragedy. Almost the idea that it's not even knowing what the words are, but that moment of Kaddish is meant to express a certain strength, a certain hope, a certain longing, and there's that religious connection that is experienced. I think it's interesting that he says that not everyone knows how to say Shema, but people know Kaddish. I just saw an article today. Governor John Shapiro of Pennsylvania wrote his autobiography. So of course he's in the news for all of his religion, the arson attack on his house on Pesach, and then his being vetted and then rejected from being a vice presidential candidate. So he's talking about his faith, and he says that he always says the Shema before he flies. I guess he doesn't know Tefillah Saderech, so he says Shema. But the kind of, but he talks about the idea that he mentions in the article quotes that he always didn't know how to respond when people asked him about his faith, because it's not something he talks about, something that's elemental. And so it's kind of, it's like I breathe and I have faith. So you don't ask me why I breathe, you don't ask me why I have faith. I'm sure there's more to it. You can read the book for all the details, but this idea that in a certain sense, I think Kaddish has taken on that role. And, I guess, for some, the Shema is more fundamental and is more foundational. But, I think that from a communal perspective, the Kaddish has become that type of a response. And it makes sense because it is anchored in this idea of trying to declare faith even when we're not really sure how to explain or understand what's going on around us. And I think that, that fits in with how we respond or commemorate the Shoah as one example pertaining to today or every day, but also just in terms of how Jews grapple with setbacks and tragedy and difficulty. That the Kaddish is that elemental response, and I think that in particular the Shoah very much changed that approach to Kaddish, whether it be in Rabbi Oshri's responsa, whether it be Yom HaKaddish HaKlali, or in the sentiments expressed by Rav Amital, or how we've seen it the last couple of years since October 7th, that role of expressing our hopes that exactly what God told Yecheskel to declare, that there is a sense of that growing sanctification in our world.
The Shema